then I can.
Yep. All right. So we started that, but yes, you should have screen sharing permission. So,
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
Yeah.
So I guess, first off, I would just like to welcome you very, very much and say thank you for coming to join us today. First off, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your career and who you are.
All right. So thank you so much, Sara and Tania, for inviting me to speak to your students. I know this is a course on global journalism, and I come from the country of India, which is the world's largest democracy, which has a free press, where press is the fourth pillar after the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, and then we have a free press. So it's really important in our democracy. And I'm Deepthi Ganapathy, and I used to work as a journalist before becoming a full-time faculty at India's leading business school called the Indian Institute of Management at Bangalore in India. So I did my master's in mass communication and journalism. And then I started working immediately, like maybe from my second year master's, I was interning, I dabbled in radio, television, print, and digital media. And I worked full-time first as a reporter with Deccan Herald, which is a mainstream, newspaper in India. I worked there for a year, and for 7 years, I worked with the Times of India as a principal correspondent. The Times of India is India's leading broadsheet. It is owned by the Bennett and Coleman group. And it has in its group a number of multimedia organizations. So I say this because though I worked as a print journalist, you have to customize your content to a blog, to something that every multimedia within the organization could pick up freely and modify it according to where they wanted to put it up. So it was a great time to work in journalism at that time because you had to embrace newer forms of media. And after I left journalism full-time, I pursued my PhD in Twitter and political communication. And then I started teaching, but I don't teach journalism. However, I continue to research, in that field. For instance, Tania has had invited me as a co-author for her paper where she analyzed human trafficking articles in the IBSA framework in India, Brazil, and South Africa. And she very graciously invited me to, collaborate for the India leg of her paper, something that I'm going to talk about. And then I started getting interested in how the news media really thinks about issues like climate change, health communication. And so I keep in touch with journalism through my research work, at least, though I don't teach it to, I teach MBA students, I teach them aspects of business communication, I teach them ESG, which is environmental, society and governance, how that aspect needs to come into business, how sustainability needs to be communicated into business. So yeah, that's what my background has been.
It sounds like you've done so many incredible things, and then to be able to turn that into being able to do research on it. And, you mentioned, a lot of the part of this class for the students is we want them to just learn about media and journalism in other countries, especially countries that are not the United States. So from your experiences and your research, I definitely want you to talk about some of the issues, but just to start, what is it like being a journalist in India? It's a broad question, but if I asked you that, what would you say it is like?
Well, it's a very exciting world here because on one hand, we are dealing with socioeconomic issues, the disparity in the per capita income of the population. There are societal challenges. At the same time, India is $1 trillion booming economy, right? So to be able to capture at the grassroots what's happening, and at the same time, the corporate or the business aspect of it is quite challenging for journalists to do. And that makes a journalist a jack of all trades. Literally, they have to know the best of both worlds and how to kind of balance the two, because projecting everything as hunky-dory on one side while not addressing the gaps that are there in society could be quite a challenge. However, I'd like to start this discussion by sharing my screen. And if you can see my screen, this is an article that I wrote in 2007 on the occasion of World Literacy Day. Here was a retired bank officer giving back to society by adopting a government-run school and adopting that school and making it as good as any other school. So the idea here is that the government came up with this scheme and said, come and adopt a school, because they knew that the societal gap is so huge in India, that there's so much that civil society can do, right? And there are so many people who retire, who want to give back to society. They have so much time, they have so much resources. So here was a small way in which this person was contributing by adopting a government school, making it, it's so different in terms of the way in which the teaching was happening. And I just did this story, but eventually it got picked up and got nominated for the CNN Young Journalist Award 2007 that year. Yeah, and it was pretty interesting because there were nominations from the entire Asia Pacific region, and that's how it opened up a plethora of opportunities for me when I saw journalists coming from the Asia Pacific region, the kind of stories they were covering, why they got nominated to that award function, and to see how citizen journalism was being used in a very powerful way.
It's very interesting. We've talked a lot about citizen journalism and what that is and the need for that in so many different ways in different countries. So I guess kind of thinking and playing off that, you talked about, some of the issues that you've covered as well. I mean, that's a fantastic story, but you had mentioned that climate change, I know you and Tania have done some human trafficking. Talk a little bit about, coverage of that and how, especially in India, how the media is covering that.
Sure. So let me just share my screen again. And so my journey really started with climate change with this article, and I'm going to the Deccan Herald website. It's an article on how bees feel the sting of climate change, and it was part of. So I was invited to the International Journalists Network, and I was featured as a Journalist of the Month there. And they had a series of workshops on how to cover climate issues and things like that. And then they said, okay, then now why don't you write a story from the workshop? And that got me thinking that, let me look closer home, because honey is something that I use every day in my food, it comes from the honeybees, and honeybees are so vital to our ecosystem. They are very delicate organisms. So I thought, let me go to all these honey collectors across the Western Ghats, which is India's rainforest, and see how the produce is dwindling. And what was surprising was that my story was not getting published in any newspaper outlet. And this was when I was a freelancer, working in the academia, and I was actively writing as a freelancer after my journalism stint. And then I saw that people were not really interested in publishing something like this. And that got me thinking that, if the mainstream media is thinking about stories from freelancers, they want stories that are sensational. They want stories that have a political angle or something like that, or a celebrity angle, and nobody's ready to publish something about the environment. And this was in 2016. And that was how my journey into understanding how the media covers climate change took importance. And I have recently published a book with Routledge. The book is doing very well because it looks at these frames, right, on how the media chooses to publish about climate change, and that's where I argue that now's the time for the media to step up efforts and speak for the environment and show it as a positive way into which we can understand how to bring about solutions, not show it as a doomsday narrative, but make the reader interact, engage with the problem itself while reporting about it, instead of showing it as a doomsday narrative where nothing can be done. So because it involves a behavioral change and an adoption of a new way of living, the media should step in their efforts towards addressing this issue. And so that was my talk about this issue of climate change. And coming to the story that I did with Tania, the research project that I did with her, it was called Press Coverage Framing Analysis Reveals Little to No Influence of Human Trafficking Cessation Despite India's Role. And then we looked at two newspapers, which was the Hindustan Times and the Times of India, in the backdrop of the 70th anniversary of our independence. And we looked at frames that how has India's national press framed human trafficking, HT's human trafficking, and we looked at the framing pre-IPSA and post-IPSA, and whether there was any indication among news reports on the influence of India's domestic practices. And so we did a little bit of analysis. We saw what were the stylistic choices, what devices were journalists using, and we found that they predominantly went by official sources. Like, for instance, if there is a human trafficking culprit who has been caught, and that report would be carried, and that eventually led us to think that there is very little that journalists themselves are doing in terms of investigating or unearthing the issue. They just go with whatever has been reported. And also we looked at the number of words, whether that newspaper article was on front page, whether it was pushed into the newspaper into a small single column article. So all these showed the importance or the irrelevance of the issue itself, in terms of seeing how the frames were kind of looked at. So these were predominantly the frames that were covered. And this article, I'm sure you can share this journal paper with your students as well. It's very interesting to read it. Yeah, because we've actually taken out excerpts from the newspaper and done it. Yeah, thanks to Tania who did the work.
Well, I couldn't have done it without you, Deepti. Your experience and expertise as a journalist in India really ripened and richened the study. Those perspectives, understanding the socioeconomic, the cultural, the political implications, that's all part of the framing and how journalists come to tell their stories.
Yeah. And remember, there was this article about a celebrity who was going on music concerts and taking people along with him, and they were masquerading as human trafficking victims. And it's very difficult for someone else to understand that unless you understand how celebrities are glorified or glamorized in the Indian context. So if something is happening in context with them, then the media just goes bonkers and sensationalizes the whole issue, and it gets blown out of proportion. But if it's with an ordinary person, then that issue just gets swept under the carpet. So yeah, these are very cultural nuances that go along with the setting, and I think that's how we looked at this framing issue. Yeah.
Would you say, is there, I know there's press freedom, but is there any with companies or control or things? I know there's been some things in the media recently. Do journalists have, how do we, what kinds of things do you face when it comes to I guess it would be the control or the freedom to report and to do these things? What is the status? Because I do know the students have been reading some of the things that have been happening there with some of, I guess, the bigger companies or bigger trying to, kind of take over things. So I'm curious what your kind of perspective on that is.
Yeah, so those are related to ownership patterns. So predominantly, when we studied journalism in university, right, we would learn about whether a newspaper would take a pro-establishment or an anti-establishment stand. For instance, the Hindu, the Indian Express, the Times of India would take a very middle stance. So we would say, look at the editorials and analyze an issue, and that's how we would learn about it. And we would study media ownership patterns, but we would largely know that the Hindu belongs to a certain family, or the Indian Express belongs to a certain group or an identity, and now what's happening with the media is that, yes, you're right, they are being bought by huge conglomerates, and that is creating the difference in editorial policies, the way the newspaper article chooses to report about it. But at the same time, there is nothing to stop one from becoming a media entrepreneur themselves, because digital media doesn't require you to have that kind of money, power, or financial resources. You can be a YouTube blogger, you can be a vlogger, you can use the internet to create your own story. So nothing stops one from doing that. But on the whole, it takes a lot of effort to stand up to big giants in the media, because they are powerful, they control most of the elitist society, and then also you need ads, you need advertisements at the end of the day to run your channel, and advertisements come from huge political party spends, especially during election time. It comes from the circulation reports. For instance, we have the Registrar of Newspapers in India, or the Audit Bureau of Circulation. So when they put out the stats that this TV channel has the highest TRP, or this newspaper has a circulation of 700,000, then obviously the ads or the ad spends are going to reflect how the circulation is. So at the end of the day, it's a business too, right? Yeah.
So what would you say? These students are very interested. I mean, I've been very pleased with how excited they are to sort of explore, and they're actually going to be looking at newspapers throughout the country to cover specific issues, how they cover climate change, et cetera. What would you say what would you say to them about things they should look for as they're looking at how the groups that are doing, media in India cover these big issues, whether it's climate change, if it's health, it's, politics, it's the culture, it's society. Any thoughts on what they should look for, or how to kind of look at that as they're kind of doing some framing analysis?
Yes, I would definitely tell them not to rely on one source of information. For instance, if there is a freelancer writing for The Guardian about this village which is suffering from drought in India, it is a very one-sided story. I would urge them to look at more localized reports. They can easily use a translator option if it's in a vernacular language. But you have the internet, so please do a little more search to know the true story, instead of relying on one article about a region. So for instance, they can get a lot of data from the Ministry of Agriculture in that state. They can look at rainfall patterns. If one article is about these whole community having to migrate to the cities because their lands are drying up, they should look a little more into what the data is saying. And most of these reports are there on government websites. They are there on a lot of NGOs, not-for-profits who operate in the region. So I would say, don't just go by one report and to decide how the story is panning out, but do a little bit more research, because I've seen a lot of journalists misuse the system as well. I've seen how they can just go into one village, take one quote and misinterpret that quote just to suit their story, because that poor man or woman is never going to read where that article appeared, is never going to cross-verify and collaborate whether it is their quote, and they can just make up a quote and say so-and-so person said that and blow it out of proportion, right? So make sure that even when you're reading a story, there are sources which are official, which are maybe anonymous because the person doesn't want to reveal themselves, but it should be well-rounded, it shouldn't be one-sided. There should be quotes from different angles to make the story unbiased. So I would urge them to look for these gaps, while making an analysis, because these days, and that's an issue that, I've talked about in my IJNet interview as well, that journalists are just sitting in their offices, relying on Twitter feeds, relying on that, instead of actually going on the ground and speaking with actual people and getting an assessment of the situation. So the students must guard themselves against these reports and do a little bit of extra search, a multi-layer search. They can even go to Google Scholar and look up articles which talk about maybe, in Nepal, there was this earthquake, so how it had an impact on migration or, the agricultural practices. So they should, learn how to verify it from different sources before coming to a conclusion. And that's really my advice to students, not just to go by the report, because media itself is slowly losing its credibility because of these issues, very sadly. Yeah.
Now that actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that does.
It does. Well, I'm just kind of, Tania, anything you can think of or anything you want to have her expound on anymore as we come to the end of our time?
Deepti, I've been so impressed by the acclaim of your excellent book on climate change. Was it the bee story that led you to do that exploration? And
yes.
If you could just tell us a little bit more, that it's such a contribution.
Yes, so like I've written in the preface of my book, that the fact that I wasn't able to find a source to publish my story in the mainstream media really got me thinking that if, as a freelancer, it's so difficult for me to find a very good publication to publish my story, what is the plight of environment journalists themselves? So at my business school, one of the focus areas in my department is environment communication. So what we did on World Environment Day, June 5th, was we invited very senior environmental journalists who've been getting their bylines and covering environmental issues for 20 years. We got them to come for a workshop. And you know what they said? They said, we feel so despondent reporting about issues like environment, because when we report a crime story, there is a hero, there is a villain, somebody is easily caught and taken to task. There is a resolution of that story. But in an environmental issue, there is never a hero or a villain. There are so many interlying factors, and it's so difficult to say that the cause and effect is very black and white. And it takes a lot of time. For instance, if a local lake is getting polluted because an industry is leaving effluents into that lake and there's frotting, it'll take considerable time for the sample to get tested in a laboratory and all that. And, while the Green Tribunal comes and shuts down the industry, it takes a lot of time. They can go to court. The court case can go on and on. The legal battle can go on and on. So how do we feel a sense of accomplishment that we are the voice for the environment is their grouse, right? And that's something that got us thinking that, if only, there was a way in which, the paradigm that the media reports in, where there is a hero, there is a villain, and then there is a resolution for that story immediately, and then there's a policy change. Then, so if only that formula could work for environmental and climate change reporting, it would be easier said than done. But that's not the issue at all. And so they were feeling very, very disheartened by the whole thing. And you know, I mean, it was so interesting. They came out with so many stories where they were up in arms against local mafia mining, who were exploiting the mines, or, you know, government policies or regulations or business magnets. But that's the story everywhere. I was in Hawaii for the East-West International Conference, and there was this entire coast, the 7-mile coast, where the people of Hawaii reclaimed that coastline and bought it and called it public land, because they didn't want Henry Kissinger, you know, the person who was coming and building golf courses and industries there. They didn't want his company to create a whole real estate, you know, kind of a setting there. So they said, we want to see the hills of Hawaii and we want to see our coastline. So we want an uninterrupted view. And they took us to that 7-mile long coastline, and it took 50 years for that battle, for them to win that battle. So I think it's the story of every country and every community that wants this kind of thing, but it's also, and the Hawaiian story, they showed us a lot of news reports. They showed us how the media was so supportive about them, and how they had documented all this. So it's really a vigilant media that can change the tide for society. And I really hope these students become those become those channels through which this change can take place, because we want the youth like them to become much more positive in terms of reporting about these issues, rather than getting into eco grief, which is a concept very much to be heard these days with the younger population. Instead of that setting in, I hope they can espouse such movements in the future.
That's incredible.
It is. And it's so important. So many of our students are so, at least we're seeing, I was in communication all around, but our environmental studies, that they are just really interested in exploring this. So I do think that's good to hear, that there is, the journalists and communicators need to be thinking about this. And I feel hopeful that we're going to see some next generation actually tackle this and take it on, especially in the media and reporting world.
Yeah, and I put a few links for you so that you can share it with students, and they can use these as resources.
I will definitely do that. Well, thank you so much. This has been lovely to meet you, and thank you. I know the students are really going to enjoy hearing this, and I just thank you for your time, and thank you for all the work that you're doing.
It's a pleasure always to talk to students, and I do wish that they are very successful with their search, about the Indian media, and that they have really good insights. And do let me know in what way I can help you as well when they finish that assignment as well. But it's been a pleasure talking to both of you, Sara and Tania. I almost feel like I'm there interacting with you.
Anytime you want to come visit, I know you've got Tania, you've got all of us. You would be more than welcome. I know it's busy with everything, but you have an invitation to Loyola anytime you would like. So
thank you so much. Yeah.
Well, thank you again. Have a wonderful day, and just really thank you so much. I can't tell you how much we appreciate it.
That's fine. Thank you so much. Bye. Bye,
Thank you, Deepti. I'll be in touch.
Yes, bye.
Bye.